All right. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah. That's, it was Gavin's turn to present. Yeah. So I will fill in that gap here and cover some of this material, and then I'll leave space for Gavin to present. I think, Adam, when you're presenting, we just have the one.
Yeah, I'm the only one at this point.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So yeah, there's space there. So we'll have two presentations that week. I'll confirm that with Gavin. So Adam, you and him. And then as we were mentioning, we've got Landon and Patrick next week. And then we have that makeup week. I think it's on the 7th, Tuesday. All right. The essays are due. So you're handing in your essays. There are no readings on the docket. I thought we'd have a review. We could see maybe it's abbreviated, but the discussion has been lively here, so at the very least we'll have a discussion, and I'll try to present some ideas to stitch the course together at that point. Mindful of the fact that we don't have an exam, and so the sort of mercenary dimension of why am I going to this class may not be immediately present beyond handing your essay in, but hopefully we're here for reasons that aren't entirely mercenary because we want to study the subject matter and the text. So
That's what the essays do that day, because everyone's going to show up for the essay, and then they're obliged to stay.
that ship has sailed at this point. Yeah.
What day is that? Sorry, I wasn't.
The 7th, Tuesday, I believe it is. Yeah.
Wow, I think I'm sick.
I'm sorry, I have an appointment at 12. I'm gonna have to go.
Well, I hope we all want to be here, but there you have it. I know it's a stressful time at the end of the semester. Even that much more important to try to enjoy the process as much as we can. Although I have to say, having been in school for my entire adult life, that feeling of the end of semester never gets old. Like that, we talk about what is freedom, positive freedom, negative freedom. Freedom is that moment of liberation, like school's out for Christmas holidays or school's out for the summer. That's a very real sense of what freedom is like. Yeah. Well,
Which is so wonderful, by the way, about
It is.
saying how all these other schools down south, whatever, they're all, wow, my last exam's on the 22nd of December. I'm like, I've been off for 2 weeks.
when do the exams wrap up for you folks? When do they finish?
I think it's 12 now. Mine's the 14th.
14th, early on then.
Essay is basically the last thing I have to hand in, except I have one take home.
Excellent.
That's
So-
on the 17th.
And then school is back on the 9th, I believe it is, something like that, in January. So then you'd have 3 full weeks off.
Yeah.
3 weeks to read whatever you want. That's what I delight in over the holidays. And there's something different, isn't there, between having a reading on the reading list that you know that you have to read, and just being able to choose whatever you like and read whatever you want. There's a sense of freedom to that also.
Tell us what the reading schedule is for the honor seminar.
Would you? Okay.
I would.
Okay.
It's hard to get up to
I think we're all in that class anyway.
How,
It's nice to be prepared.
absolutely. How many people are in that honor seminar here? Many. Most of the class. Okay. Thank you for the prompt on that. And so what I'll say there is, don't bother reading the Republic. We'll read that through together, and I think it'd be helpful to, go a book or two a week to make our way through close exegesis. That will be the front end of the course. But, pardon me?
It's not like the bashing where I have to read the politics in one week.
No, generally when I do the politics, I'll give it 3 or 4 weeks, something like that. These are dense texts that deserve some time. But what I would say in terms of getting ahead on the readings is I'll try to get the seminar readings, the ones that you'll be responsible for, in advance, get you that reading list so that over the break, that's a good idea. You can kind of read ahead and think about. And the seminar will be very similar to what we're doing here. you know, a little bit longer. You know, it's a fourth year course as opposed to a third year course, but you're the same group of students, so very similar. Yeah, that's a good prompt. I'll try to get that to you by the break.
Is the marking scheme similar? Like, is it going to be,
Mm-hmm.
what is it, what do you call it, like
What's that?
like a proposal,
Yeah.
actual essay, I'm assuming it's longer.
Yeah.
And then your seminar presentation, and then you also want a seminal,
Synoptic essay.
synoptic essay.
We also
Same-
have
same thing.
participation grades, like it is in other subjects.
Well, and that's an interesting question. So that has changed both in this class and in the honor seminar because we have students who are taking the course online. And so their participation is going to be of a different quality. And I was told that the grading scheme has to be the same for both sections, so that as much as possible that these two sections of this one course are the same. Yeah.
My
Unless we
idea
have
of
some
like discussion
big
is,
Zoom
just what
call.
they're doing for the other classes, what I do for my history art seminar is, there's a discussion point in class. You can get full marks for that, but there's also a discussion posting on Blackboard.
Mm.
And that's an option for online students to get discussion posting as well.
I heard really mixed reviews about the discussion posts as a means of generating participation grades, partly through NUSU actually. And they'd collected a lot of feedback from students from last year, and a lot of students were saying it seemed like a kind of a token effort.
Yeah, it's also a token grade, so.
It shouldn't be. The participation grade is quite real. The reason I like having a participation grade in this sort of class is to make sure that everyone is involved even when it's not your seminar. Everyone's done the readings, even if you're not presenting on that topic. And the way I usually allocate the seminar grade or the participation grade is to say, if I remember you, that's a good sign. If I don't remember you at the end of the course, that's probably not a good sign.
If I remember you.
Yeah, it's simple.
I will say,
Yeah.
like, from the discussion post, from my personal experience, it was a token effort. It felt like a thing. It's a lot easier to have discussions in class with people when the
Mhm.
conversations are dynamic and
Mhm.
kind of in the moment,
Like,
than when it's over like chat that like.
you're forgetting what discussion posts are designed to do on Blackboard. I think the main design purpose they served was just to make sure that you kept up with the week's work.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think there were, I think the better.
So what you do is if you're behind in your readings, you read everybody else's posts and you go, okay.
Landon, I like it.
Let's see how I can melt this together. I haven't done that.
I haven't done it as well, but.
I think that makes sense.
Please
if
don't get
people's
rid of it, I like
discussion
the easy 20%.
But I thought of
I
it.
could
you
never
know.
do that. I didn't make, like, I was like, what, how do I know that they even know what they're talking about?
Exactly.
I could never
Hmm.
trust a discussion
That's
post, I have
because
to learn
you listen
myself.
to the
Hmm.
lecture and then you go, well, I don't want to write all this again, so I'll just.
Yeah.
I think the most ridiculous requirement that's sometimes included in discussion posts is to make replies.
Oh,
yeah,
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 so
reply
it's
on your
like
students.
this.
Wow,
John
I really
Smith,
love how you
this was
took
a
2
great
plus
idea.
2 to make 4. Excellent use of the theory of addition. Like, really just.
Yeah.
I love how you
So
bring this
dumb.
idea to the table.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
revolutionary.
agree.
And-
That's perfect.
And is there,
John Smith, I found your comments insightful. Well, yeah, because it's a quote from the text.
I mean,
you
yeah.
know?
Yeah, we also like use the owls in like a Zoom call room, where it's like the online students participate on Zoom,
mm,
and we're still here in the owl. That thing right there films us to them.
is that how that works?
Yeah, so there's a rotating camera on the top. And
Really?
I kept my discussion
I haven't,
fresh.
I have a class
I don't
here
know
on
about this,
Mondays.
guys.
And there's a rotating camera on the top that moves whoever's talking.
Really?
And there's a mic that picks up the whole room.
Well, I'll need to figure out how this works because the seminar would be helped out by this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so then they can fully see who's talking face to face, because they see it on Zoom.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then they can participate in the class too, because they're on the Zoom board right there.
Mm.
So if you sit like on that end of the room, if they have a question, they can just raise their hand and you see it on Zoom, and they can
Hmm.
actively play a role in the class.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah.
Evan Hoffman.
Yeah.
Take any of his
Yeah,
courses.
they're fun.
They're
They're
good,
fun.
they're
They're
classy,
great.
they're very
Um,
practical.
Yeah, and it's just like, they're like easy to follow.
Super
I'll
easy.
have to go check them out then.
Yeah, do it, seriously.
You can tell he's been doing it a
What's
long
his,
time too,
subject?
eh?
Yeah.
Like he's a professional
What's
online
his
educator.
subject again?
Is it,
Mhm.
I kinda have it on
It's
already,
in-
but
it's in poli sci?
instead of like having it in class.
I'll ask the tech people. No, that's a good tool. Good to
Yeah,
know.
I don't know how you plan to do your honors seminar yet, but that's how we're doing the history ones.
Gotcha.
Just a Zoom call there,
Yeah.
discussion here, and then
This quote's by
you
Ronald
chime in
Reagan.
both.
I see. Interesting.
It's still my beating heart. Ronald Reagan, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, we should probably.
Yeah, let's dive into this.
We wasted 15 minutes.
Let's no, we not wasted. This is helpful to think forward to that seminar. How do we make it better? This is my first experience with online teaching, and so I want to make sure it's worthwhile for the students, obviously, in the class.
How's
And
the
those,
online going for you though? Like, how's it going with your students?
it's hard
It's
to.
your first year, right? Like, do you-
Yeah. Let's talk in a non-recorded fashion
yeah,
about
yeah.
that, maybe.
Yeah, this is recorded.
This is recorded. Yeah.
Hello, people.
I'll have to have a break.
No, yeah, we'll talk about it on the break. And yeah, students who are listening online, I'd love to hear your perspective on it, getting some back and forth going. All right, so I will work us through a bit of George Grant here. I think some of you have read Grant in the past. Lament for a Nation is perhaps his most famous political work, hugely influential in terms of generating this sort of renewed sense of Canadian nationalism in terms of what that would look like. Yeah,
So I just wanted to ask quickly again, who wrote Intent for a Nation?
so that's Michael Byers.
That was Michael Byers.
Michael Byers, and obviously a play on Grant's title.
Yeah, it's kind of a response in a lot of ways.
It really is. It explicitly is a response to Lament for a Nation, saying that there is something distinctive about Canadian national identity, that there is a purpose for Canada in terms of its international status. The question he asked is, what is Canada for? Of course, for Grant, the Canadian situation is most distinctive in terms of our precarious relation with our imperial neighbor to the south, the United States, what Grant calls the spearhead of modernity. And he sees really little place for an independent Canadian foreign policy in relation to that behemoth to the south. But I'd like to focus in here. The topic here is, I think, decidedly more philosophical than Lament for a Nation, though it has very real practical consequences also in terms of how we think about political identity.
This chapter, he explicitly talks about institutions needing to be passed.
Well, and you know, if I could light on one phrase of Grant's that he comes back to again and again, this key concept that Grant borrows from Plato is expressed in this phrase, the love of one's own. In terms of how we understand our identity, we understand our identity in terms of a love of what's our own, which obviously begs the question, well, what is distinctly our own? How do we articulate those goods, those ideas of the good that we all share in, and that make us who we are? Now, Grant borrows this from Plato, and this is germane, considering that I think many of you will be in the honors seminar next semester, and we will begin again with Plato's Republic. Spend quite a bit of time on it, and just to light on this idea of love as being constitutive of political community. For Plato, there are two kinds of eros. There are different Greek words for different kinds of love. You have philia, which is kind of like friendly love. You know, philosopher is a friend to wisdom. You have, in the New Testament especially, written in ancient Greek, of course, you have agape. It comes up for the ancient Greeks as well, but it's a special importance to the New Testament. The idea being kind of God's overflowing love for his creation that can never be entirely reciprocated. And then we have eros. Eros obviously pertaining to erotic love and related to procreation there too, but extended to an erotic attachment to the idea of the good itself, that we're somehow compelled to it, that we find completion in our loving relations with an idea of the truth or of the good in a way that's comparable to how we find a sense of completion with a romantic partner. That the idea here is that there's something essential to your being that's beyond yourself. I hope we've all had a chance to be in loving relations, yeah? And you really do get that sense that without that other human being, you wouldn't be fully who you are, yeah? The story is told in the Symposium. You've probably heard this story in various forms of the Circle people. Aristophanes tells the story of the Circle people who, the story is that once human beings were wholes, and we had 4 arms and 4 legs, we were like spheres, and we would move around by just rolling like little gymnasts through the world. But we became so powerful, so complete, that we threatened the gods, and the gods cut us in half. The gods cut us in half in such a way that we are then taken up with the task of trying to find our other half. You've probably heard that language, romantic love is like searching for your other half, someone who completes you, someone who complements you. That idea is owed to the Symposium and to Aristophanes, this idea of the Circle people there, that love indicates a kind of completeness. Yeah? We find completion in the experience of love. And, there are obviously different kind of rungs on that ladder of erotic ascent. So, even to the extent of, who doesn't love food? I really enjoy it, I know, at least. And you know that you need it when you don't have it. Yeah? And you're kind of satisfied when you eat a really, really good meal. But you realize at a point that that kind of attraction to food is kind of satisfying, but not completely, because you're going to eat and then you're going to have to eat again. Yeah? Similarly, you probably encountered this when you have a friend who goes through that first puppy dog stage of love where they fall madly in love with someone else, and you never see them again. Like they won't go out. They're just with that one person for a period of time, and then you realize that there is life beyond just that one person. There's no enduring satisfaction in that. You need your friends. We love our friends as well, and so there's a kind of moment of transcendence that's built into all of our experiences of eros in this way, where you say, there's satisfaction, not quite. Maybe there's more satisfaction in the love of community rather than in the love of just one person. And so we find our way to wholeness and completion in relation to our community, a loving relation with community. And yet even there you say, well, my community is amazing. North Bay is a nice city, but it's not the whole of things. My friends are telling me I'm becoming too provincial and I need to go visit them in London or travel around and see the wider world, and they're on their way to convincing me at this point. But and so this kind of erotic ascent, these moments of transcendence for Plato ultimately lead us towards a love of the idea of the good itself that informs all other forms of goodness, whether it's a good community or a good human being, or even just a really good meal for that matter. This is how love works for Plato. And it indicates then too what we're suited for by our very nature, what is our own. For Plato, and I'm beginning here because this is the kind of vantage that Grant takes on in order to criticize the idea of the good understood in terms of progress. This is how he steps back and transcends the determinations of Nietzsche's radical historicism, and back behind that the progressive visions of Hegel and of Kant. He steps back to Plato and this idea of a love of one's own as a critical place from which we can call into question those underlying assumptions within liberalism and modernity. It's just to say, why the heck are we talking about love in a course on politics? This is Grant's beginning. I should say too that for Plato, there are two different kinds of eros. There's one that's characterized by frenetic compulsion. You know, you're all familiar with Alcibiades from Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Alcibiades is a perfect picture of the student of Socrates going wrong. He's a great character. He's really compelling. Pardon me? But you know what's so intriguing in my mind about Alcibiades is that he just loves to love. He loves this and then this and then this and then this. You know, this is the type of person who would have this lover and then this lover and then this lover, or that would have one meal and then be looking forward to the next one already. Yeah, and we see this in political terms when Alcibiades makes the argument that Athens needs to invade Sicily, that what holds them together, that what's most properly speaking their own as Athenians, is this endless pattern of imperial conquest. That's what glues the Athenians together in Alcibiades' mind, and that's this form of eros gone wrong. For Plato, what's important is the object of erotic attention. What's important is that, say, the person that you love is good. You love them because they're good. You don't love them just for the sake of loving. You love them because there's something good in them. There's something virtuous in them. You love your political community not just as a kind of a project, but because there's something particularly just about that political community. And you know, I guess the tragedy of that is that there are some political communities that are easier or harder to love than others. One can only imagine what it must have been like to be a German in the post-Second World War era, where it would be almost impossible to love what is your own. This is part of Grant's political dilemma, writing here in 1968. In the context of the war in Vietnam, he says that Canadian complicity in Vietnam and you know, the American drive in terms of that war, its imperial drive, made it hard for us to love what is our own in that particular moment. Yeah? So that becomes a real question. What's worth loving? And we can have, for Plato, a rational discussion about that, saying that some things are inherently more lovable than others. There's an ontological dimension to this, in that things, I went through that kind of ladder of erotic ascent there earlier. The key difference as you move up that ladder is the degree to which the thing that you love or the person you love endures. That for the classics, for Plato, that which endures is more real, is more substantial than that which is ephemeral and changes. There's some sense in which for the ancients, change as such is unintelligible, except to the extent that it contributes to a given end. Yep.
Change is, pardon me?
Unintelligible for the ancients. It's just kind of chaotic, random, unless it's directed towards an end. So you can understand like the pattern of growth, for example, in a living being, to the extent that that living being becomes an adult. So for Aristotle, we become citizens capable of participating in deliberation as to what our city should do, our political community should do. We are animals that possess rational speech. So our growth, our movement over time is understandable. We can literally make sense of it to the extent that it contributes to that end. But that end never changes. Human nature never changes for the ancients. Change is unintelligible in that it is directed towards certain ends that do not change. That's what we can understand. And that, for Plato, is ultimately the idea of the good itself. So what we love really matters for Plato. Love of food is good but ephemeral, transitory. Love of one particular person, also good, but to the extent that there's commitment there, but also transitory. We're mortal creatures after all. Love of political community, more universal, more enduring, but we know too that every political community has its beginning and will have its end. Ultimately, the only kind of longing that is purely satisfying is philosophy for Plato. Love of the idea of the good itself. That's what brings us most satisfaction. That's what brings us closest to what is, to what has real being. And this is one of the most counterintuitive parts of Plato. This is something that Nietzsche ridicules through and through, to say that the most real thing of all is the idea of the good. As moderns, we would tend to take that as being the most transitory, ephemeral, subjective thing of all. What's good for you is not what's good for me, and so on. And what's good for me in one moment may not be what's good for me in another. For Plato, that's the most real thing that there is, that informs the goodness of any one particular thing. So there are these two kinds of love: this frenetic compulsion and love that's oriented towards something that endures. I just want to read a quick quote, again, to locate the origins of this idea in Grant back in Plato. This is Socrates talking to Glaucon. Glaucon is quite impetuous. You could read the Republic perhaps as the effort to tame Glaucon and to convince him that the life of tyranny is not choice-worthy. That's kind of the pedagogical project of the book. And at this point, Glaucon is kind of on his way. Socrates asks Glaucon, he says, "Shall we be bold and say this? Of the desires concerned with the love of gain and the love of victory," you could understand love in terms of a love of money, or you could understand love in terms of a love of honors, holding offices, that kind of thing. If you're an ambitious young person, these are the things that you may want: more money, more power. That's not an unusual set of desires. And it's important for Socrates, again, because he's talking to the youth of Athens, politically well-connected youth of Athens, and is saying that those things that you think you love, that make life worth living, are not choice-worthy, and the life devoted to material acquisition and the acquisition of political power is not the good life. Only the life of philosophy is the good life. It's kind of, in a way, bleeding off the very best from Athenian society so that they would be devoted to philosophy instead of politics. Of the desires concerned with the love of gain and the love of victory, some, followers of knowledge and argument, pursue in company with them the pleasures to which the prudential part leads, and take only these. So it says, if you're prudent, you'll recognize that the acquisition of wealth is ephemeral, power is ephemeral, judgment teaches us the limits of those kinds of lives. Take only these. Such desires will take the truest pleasures, so far as they can take true ones. So there are true pleasures. There are some pleasures that are real and true, and there are some pleasures that are passing fancies, because they follow truth, and those that are most their own. If indeed what is best for each thing is also most properly its own. What is best for each thing is what is most properly its own. So by loving that thing, it becomes more itself. The objects of erotic attention, the things that we love, make us who we are. It's not random. There's a great line from Nietzsche. I think this is Beyond Good and Evil in the Aphorisms. He says that you choose a friend like you'd pick a star out of the sky, but you can't afford to tell them that. So what Nietzsche is saying there is that when you choose a friend, it's just like it's random. You say, "Hey, how about you?" But of course, you can't tell your friend that, "Yeah, I just kind of need a friend, and you're around and you'll do," kind of thing. Pardon me? But even there, you're being kind of sarcastic, yeah. And you reach out and you pat your friend on the shoulder. Yeah, friends can tease each other, but you can't tell a friend that I just kind of need you and you're handy by, and it could really be anyone, and there's nothing really that special about you. That's not a very friendly. That's not a very friendly thing to say. But that wouldn't be a true friendship. How could you distinguish between a true friendship then and any other sort of happenstance meeting?
I'm friends with everyone then.
But does that mean anything whatsoever? If you're friends with everyone, you've got to say that you're my people.
Like, as much as like, Nietzsche is right about like the right that it is certainly random, but it's not purely random. Like there's happenstance involved because
Sure.
I can't meet everyone. That's
Yeah.
random chance, but
Yeah.
everyone has their own friend criteria
Mhm.
that we have. Like, for example, I walk, say I meet Landon, and then some druggie that I share
Thanks.
nothing in common with, or
Oh, okay.
or I'll choose him as my friend because I have more in common with him, and there's more of a relationship there than
Mhm.
the guy that does crack all day that doesn't talk about politics.
Mm.
That's
So
not random that I would choose Landon over that.
yeah, so you like
What a contest. Thank you so much, Jared, to be choosing me over a crackhead. I'm really, really grateful.
But from the sounds of it, irrespective of who you're not friends with for a variety of reasons, in terms of who you are friends with, you said you both like talking about politics. So you have overlapping interests there. You like the same sorts of things. Huh? And so it's that basis of affinity, a kind of likeness that draws groups together. It's not an astonishing thing that Plato was saying. It's kind of an obvious thing in a way, but there's something substantial to it. What he's saying is that experience of affinity or of friendship, philia, or of love, eros, indicates what we're suited for. And we tend to think of love in a very different, like love of our own, for us as moderns, is a difficult concept to understand. It's alien in so many ways because we think of love in very subjective terms. You've heard that phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, love is just a kind of set of affinities that you may have for whatever random reason of your own, that it's somehow fickle or something like this. No, Plato says that love and reason are a good pair, actually. Reason tells us, again, what's worth loving based upon the ontological stability of that object of erotic attention. Things that endure are more lovable than things that are passing. Yeah? So, loving someone for their wit and their wisdom is probably a better choice than loving someone for their looks, which we know fade and pass over time. Yeah. Again, obvious kind of point. So this love of one's own identifies for Socrates the truth of a being. This is an ethical and an ontological claim that would ground reason in love. And at this point in the dialogue, a kind of somewhat tamed lover of consumption. Earlier, Glaucon had said, what about the relishes, Socrates? What I want are cakes and courtesans and couches, more. At this point, he kind of goes along and says, but of course, that is what is most its own. Yeah, please.
When you were saying, I just trying to type this correctly, that when you were saying to Plato, love is what's love? No, love is what did you? Love is something of one's own. And he said it identifies the truth of being. So that's
Yeah.
the ontological part.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then he said that it is grounded in reason.
Yeah.
And grounded in reason and love.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to make sure that I write this correctly because I know that this is going to be important for next semester.
We'll pick this up again. Yeah. Yeah.
So did I write this correctly? Or did I miss something?
No, that sounds fair. That assessment sounds fair. Yeah. And again, the relationship between love and reason is one where reason helps us to decide what's inherently lovable. And in so doing, reason helps us to decide what is our own, i.e. politically, who are we?
I mean, is that really reason though? Like, let's just use romantic relationship for example. If I if dating someone's not always a rational choice, it's something that just kind of happens. In fact, some may argue that hate is more rational than love. with hate, it's just love with an excess of reason.
I don't understand the relation to hate. Let's just stick on the loving relations here. You could be smitten with someone and then realize that they're kind of crazy, that they're all over the place, that they may be pleasant one moment and very unpleasant the next. Presumably, you would be inclined to love someone who kind of contributes that sense of stability to your own life, that you love them today and you love them tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. Now it waxes and wanes. Of course, we're all human beings, each with our foibles. But it seems pretty clear that some human beings are more lovable than some other human beings, each for our own reasons, but with that eye towards stability and happiness. If love is to use Grant's language, love is an intimation of deprival. It gives us a sense of what we're missing, and then inclines us towards a sense of completeness, to the extent that we can, be together with those who we love. And so the political consequences come to bear there. The reason I bring this up, hopefully this doesn't sound too arcane, but the idea of a love of one's own is the basis of Grant's critique of liberalism. We've now become acquainted with the sort of high water marks of liberalism, progressive liberalism, in Kant and in Hegel. Actually, Grant was quite an admirer earlier on in his intellectual career of both Kant and Hegel for the sense of nobility that is associated with human historical purpose. But keeping in mind that the idea of the good there is, for Hegel at least, a settled one. We know what the good is. The good is realizing human freedom and equality in the world. Philosophy is over in that sense and becomes kind of a technocratic matter of realizing that goal the world over, taking this end of history in principle and turning it to an end of history in practice. Liberalism cuts us off from the kind of transcendent idea of the good that Grant and Plato are presenting here. The sense that there's a good outside of time, ultimately. If the good is that which endures, ultimately for Plato and for Grant, the good is eternal. It is always good, and it is universal also, everywhere good. That said, and now we'll deal with this more next semester when we turn to misinterpretations of Plato's Republic, portraying him as a totalitarian. Though Plato does present a singular idea of the good, what's important for us humans, all too human as we are, is that we know that we're not, there's the question of the immortality of the soul, and that's kind of an open question for Plato, but we know that we're aware of our mortality. We know that we have a particular perspective on things. You may love this person because they're geographically close by. So there is that particularity, and because of that, acknowledging that, knowing that we have our own dear opinions, we always fall short of this idea of the good itself. Yeah.
How would ethnic groups play into this idea? Kind of like a Max Weber reading of Plato, where it's this happenstance. What's that word? Arbitrary divide, where it's just what we love is arbitrary and based on where we just so happen to be born.
Now, and I will get actually to Max Weber and Grant's critique of his objective model of the social sciences. We'll see if we have time here, but I hope to get to that. Grant, right at the beginning of this essay, says it's true that we begin with this particularity. We begin with different civilizations. We begin with different conceptions of time from one tradition to another. We begin with different conceptions of justice, different conceptions of truth even. And even within the history of Western civilization, we see these ideas of justice, of nature, of truth unfolding over time. So there is that particularity. But what's to save us from relativism? What's to save us from the historicism of Nietzsche, which indicates to us that there's no judging between these various worldviews, to use Heidegger's language. If you are to judge and say some civilizations are preferable to others, some regimes are preferable to others, no reasonable human being would choose to live in a tyranny, for example. Some regimes are vile, and others are more or less good. No one is perfect, but we can judge between them. We can say that some are more just than others.
Wouldn't it still make, even though there's a fair measure, let's just say like liberalism is our metric of good or bad, for example. Wouldn't it still be arbitrary the difference between peoples, because using that metric, fundamentally we're all free and equal, so any common good of a group is artificial and arbitrary.
That's the Weberian claim, yeah, because ideas of the good for Weber, who was a student of Nietzsche, ideas of the good are expressions of human values. And for Weber, unlike Plato, we cannot have a rational discussion about values. Values are subjective, each to their own. We can have a rational discussion about facts, but we can't have a rational discussion about values. And so we have this model of objectivity in the sciences and in the social sciences then too, that would preclude us from having any discussion about which regime is more just or more unjust than another. Grant was heavily influenced here by Strauss and his critique of this Weberian model of objectivity in the social sciences. You see this, for example, even objectivity in the social sciences. That's what Weber introduces, this idea of what it means to be subjective, or to be objective. And what it means is that we can separate between objective factual truths, measurable ideally, and subjective valuations, which are, because they're subjective each to their own.
Like if you take example, I'd risk saying this on camera. There's like right for children where if you point out certain things about white culture, it makes you offensive. If you point out to a minority that their culture is artificial, they get defensive. LGBT about sexuality, extra. It seems like everyone has something where if you point and critique it, they get
Yeah.
their existence is being existentially threatened and they can't interact with it.
I think that they're partly, it's clear that no civilization is perfect. No regime is perfect. All of our claims to justice, to an idea of the good, fall short, precisely because the idea of the good is transcendent. And so hopefully that would induce a sense of moderation and modesty in terms of our own appraisals of our own civilization. But what you're talking about there is more pertaining to asymmetrical relations between groups, between dominant and marginalized groups. And so the thinking presently is that it's just at the very least, at the shallowest level, just really bad taste, very impolite, let's say, to criticize minority culture from a position of privilege. But it has more to do with those asymmetries. At the root, again, every human claim to justice is measured by a standard that no human being can entirely attain. And so for Plato, the question of justice is not so much a matter of imposing an ideal onto reality. It's rather that ideal of justice is a measure by which we can judge real regimes for what they are, by which we can see injustice for what it is. But so we see an idea of the good in things. Is this a good human being? Is that a good dog? Is that a good city? Is this a good law? Is this a good custom or norm? That's how the idea of justice functions. But for Plato and for the ancients. But for Weber, you bring him up, I think quite rightly, because Grant turns to him here too. For Weber, there's a strict separation between that world of objective facts, the world of nature, for example, conceived as matter in motion, subject to forces, stuff, essentially, just material, objective facticity, just It just is. It has no inherent value in and of itself until human beings impose their valuations onto it. This is the Nietzschean element of Weber. The idea for Nietzsche is that value comes from human beings. It ultimately comes from the human will imposed upon a world of indifferent objects.
Yeah, so it's like, what's the value of this pencil, what I can do with it? If you remove me from the equation, it's what, a bunch of carbon and lead?
Sure, yeah, it's been shaped in this way or that. And we can look, well, you can look outside the window here and see quite a collection of cellulose out there that could easily be fashioned into paper or lumber or biomass or any number of things, according to what kind of value we want to attribute to it. It's difficult, though, within that rubric of the separation between facts and values, to say that there's something inherently valuable about the world of nature itself. Again, it's just stuff. The question of value only comes about when the human will figures into that mastery of human and non-human nature, to use one of Grant's definitions of technology. So again, this idea of the love of a good is a vantage from which we can criticize that fact-value distinction in the model of objectivity in the social sciences. Here's a particular example. Talking about regimes, the language we use is always important in political science. It means one thing to call a regime authoritarian. It means another thing to call a regime tyrannical. You could have a regime where power is centralized in a charismatic leader, an authoritarian leader. Now, that doesn't really tell you whether that regime is bad or good, and indeed, in the readings from Ignatieff, that question arises. Well, are authoritarian regimes perhaps more practical in terms of countering the problems that we're facing presently? But just to call them authoritarian is value neutral. It's objective. You're just describing, in a very factual way, how power is distributed within that particular regime. It means something very different to call a regime a tyranny. What is the implication there when we say a regime is a tyranny? Yeah?
That whoever the tyrant is, they're bad, they're not good, they don't have the interests of their people in mind.
Yeah,
They don't value the good.
it's a bad regime because it's ruled by a selfish leader for their own benefit, monopolizing the public sphere at the expense of their people. Yeah.
I think every authoritarian regime is inherently tyrannical.
Is inherently tyrannical. Okay. Yeah, you could.
You're robbing the people of their right to use their public rationality, their public use of positive reason. By robbing the public of that, it's an inherently tyrannical regime because you do not benefit from the use of public use of reason.
Yeah, that's a kind of classical perspective on things. I think Aristotle would agree with you there, saying that, if human beings are by nature political animals, tyrannical regimes are bad, they're not choice-worthy, they're unjust, because only one person gets to exercise their political nature, and everyone else is denied their nature. They're unnatural. Saying it's unjust is also saying it's unnatural for the ancients. But again, if we're loyal to this idea of objectivity in our social science and political science, you would want to preclude that kind of language that involves valuations from your description of things. And so it's been a kind of pushback against Weber, against objectivity in social science, against the fact-value distinction, to say that if we can't say that some regimes are more just or unjust than others, reason is failing us here, because this seems like just such an obvious and elementary truth. Again, no one would choose to live in a tyrannical regime. Yeah?
The problem is, we could find a solution to this question, but we used to be in our community in point of, what is good? The problem is, for some reason, it's very hard to come by. Even if you say, even if I say something like, public use of reason and price of individual should be our Archimedean points, then you'll get people saying, well, no, that's just Western imperialism.
Well, yeah, and that's a big part of Grant's argument here too. his argument is that there's something particularly powerful about Western civilization in terms of its, at the time, worldwide dominance. That this, and it's not just dominance in a political sense. There's this sense in which, for Grant, the idea of technology as a measure of progress has become globally ascendant in such a way that crowds out all other conceptions of the good. It is really liberating to think of human beings as free wills set apart from a world of indifferent objects. It's liberating to look at a forest and think of it just as cellulose, or it's liberating to look at a mountain and see it as a collection of minerals. It liberates you, for example, to remove the top of a mountain and put it to human uses. Pardon me?
It's like mastery of nature.
Exactly.
So then you can argue that the idea of pushing, well, it's at the risk of white man burdening us, but he's more or less kind of arguing that there's something inherently good about Western civilization in that it is the natural way forward.
He's saying there's something inherently imperial about Western civilization. Again, it has crowded out all other possibilities within the Western tradition and in relation to other traditions as well. Other languages pertaining to the good increasingly have no space in public discourse. They just don't make any sense. With the global ascendancy of liberalism.
There's a news article in Congo. It's like it's a town down south, and they're turning a golf course into a housing complex.
Okay.
But it's built on a old indigenous hunting ground, and you see the public debate around it is very much pro housing block because most people, at least our side, is like, why are we putting value on an ancient hunting ground when we can get something material we can use now?
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of see that.
Yeah, and especially older inherited ideas of the good increasingly have no place within that discourse also. As part of Grant's lament is that this idea of the love of the good as the formative political bond it's easy to dismiss it as kind of vain romanticism, pining for a long lost past that can never be any longer. Grant's conservatism is sometimes described in these terms by his critics. He's just attached to a past and finds no place for himself in the new order, and so he laments. But I think this idea of the good is super important for Grant as a critical vantage from which to criticize liberalism, that his philosophy of technology as a leveling phenomenon that reduces justice to a matter of efficiency largely, opens the door for a deeper consideration of justice than just that. And this serves also as a sort of vantage for his critique of American imperialism, seen as, again, the spearhead of modernity, and that increasingly obviates the love of one's own as a stepping stone on the way to the good. So for Grant, it becomes progressively harder for us to love what is our own, inasmuch as our own becomes indistinguishable from the innermost essence of historical humanity, like what Nietzsche describes, which is described not by some autochthonous identity, a belonging to place or a distinctive history, but as the planetary spread of technological development standing in as the good. And interestingly here for Grant, the critique of liberalism is thoroughgoing. The idea that we can articulate what the good is for historical humanity in terms of human freedom and equality, that's shot through his writing. But increasingly Grant becomes concerned that technological development can be delinked from the noble ideas of liberalism. That the justification has been, well, what's so good about technological development? Well, it's good because it makes human beings more free and equal in the world. Grant sees contemporary events at the time, I mentioned the war in Vietnam, as indications that there isn't an inherent connection between the noble ideals of liberalism and technological development for its own sake. There's something decidedly illiberal about the American war in Vietnam, for example, as a means of promoting those noble ideals. We saw something similar in the war in Iraq, with a kind of fundamental tension between those imperial means and the noble ends that they would contribute to, making the Iraqi people more free through force of arms. And we could add to that, in terms of our own experience, the rise of decidedly illiberal regimes dependent upon modern technology. It is increasingly apparent that the global spread of modern technology has not made all of the Earth's inhabitants into nice liberals. Modern technology has aided and embedded decidedly authoritarian or tyrannical regimes as well. So again, there's no clear link for Grant between liberalism and technological development.
To say if anything, self-tyrannical regimes under power, like with more advanced weaponry and stuff like that, it's harder for revolutions to take shape and stuff like that. Like Hong Kong and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
You mentioned the suppression of democratic movements, protests in Hong Kong. Yeah, you may consider, and not just to pick on China here, although it's a rather notorious example presently, the spread of a surveillance society, the suppression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and with one of the most thorough surveillance societies the world has ever seen in that part of that country. It becomes harder and harder to say that technological development makes human beings more free. That's part of the point that Grant is making here. And partly that's because he defines technology. He has two working definitions. One of those definitions is that technology is the mastery of human and non-human nature. So we don't just consider the natural world out there, the non-human natural world, as something to be mastered. Increasingly, we turn our means of technological mastery back on ourselves. And it's at that point that it becomes hard to justify what we're doing to ourselves. Yeah.
Doesn't Heidegger say there's a conflict between technology or technique versus nature, where technique wants to create a world that's really still, and nature wants to inherently be chaotic. So as you transition more and more into technology, you're inherently going to create a more and more world that doesn't want to change.
Well, I don't know about the characterization of nature as chaotic. For the ancients, nature is good. Nature is spontaneously beneficent.
Nature, it's not like, nature is capable of changing. It has a will of change.
Aristotle would say that nature has its sufficient cause within itself. It changes itself. It doesn't need a kind of a artisan to move it in this direction or that. Trees grow from the seeds. The efficient cause is within that seed. It's not external to it. But there's something good about that pattern of growth for the ancients. That's what's denied by this modern technological outlook. And again, the point is, well, how do you master that change so that it could make human beings more free in the world, so that it can have a liberating effect? So I think it's easier to see that sort of liberatory dimension of technology there. Again, it becomes harder when that technology issues forth in the mastery of human nature, say in the spread of the surveillance state, for example. Interestingly, there too, in terms of how that works, from my understanding of China's really booming surveillance apparatus, what you need to do is you need to do something similar to what we do in terms of our understanding of nature, non-human nature. We need to do something similar to ourselves. So in the same way that we understand non-human nature as stuff, matter in motion subject to forces, we need to understand human beings in that way too, as a collection of facts, as a collection of outward exhibited behaviors.
So I know the What would they think of technologies like CRISPR, ones that
Mm.
allow humans to very well code the very foundations of DNA?
Hmm. That's a fine example. That's a perfect Nietzschean example of the will to power, creating a kind of Ubermensch, overman, where
Literally code an Uberman.
yeah, where we can reshape not only the world outside to make life more comfortable for ourselves. We can reshape. So, by what standard then would you reshape our historical humanity? That is the moment of liberation
I
for
think
Nietzsche.
we have a moral obligation to, because with that technology, we can flat out we have a moral obligation to use it to save lives. We can cure genetic birth defects. We can
Mm-hmm.
cure cancer. We can cure illnesses that are passed on by genes. We can extend life. We can make humans, say, naturally warmer so we won't die of cold if we fall in the ocean. I think we have a moral obligation to do that.
And I think that's often how the sort of ethics around this is addressed, in terms of alleviating human suffering. So, for example, there was a Chinese scientist who used this CRISPR technology to genetically manipulate one of a set of twins. Yeah? And the justification that he gave and what he did to that child was to change its genetics so that it would be less likely to be infected by HIV. Yeah? And you would say, well, that's a good thing. How could you argue with that? You've liberated that child from that potentially dangerous virus. Yeah? But it's hard to see where the guardrails would be for that. That's kind of the entryway into that whole discussion. But then at that point, why stop there?
But
Just
there's a natural element.
pardon me?
There is a natural element.
A natural,
There is a natural ending stopping point.
which would be what?
We live in a liberal society. The stopping point is merely to the extent the individual consents to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's ultimately their choice. So if the individual consents to it, like even if the individual consents to even changing his personality, a core fraction of that personality will still remain within the new body because he fundamentally made that choice.
Mm-hmm.
That will be the end point.
My one concern with that is that I don't even consent to being born, so I don't know how I'm supposed to consent to having my DNA changed as a kid.
Well, let me ask you, like, if you change the baby.
Oh,
Like, you can call it, like, legally theoretical, as, like, you, for babies, consent, you keep it limited to things that are immediate risk of life. So birth defects, viruses, or any other related things that can cause instant death. And then for the other, even if we open the Pandora's box and go to more artificial changes, that's going to have to wait till the individual is probably an adult, so he can rationally
Well, I
come
think,
to his own individual conclusion.
I think the point is that the fact that it's being done and that the fact that you can or may not have a choice at all is the issue.
Mm.
It's just that there is no line, like, when it comes to technology, it doesn't seem like there is. They just
But
pretty
there
much
is
do
one-
anything for the sake of technological advancement. Well, this might save lives, maybe. But we might kill like 1 million or something first.
I mean, the technology's not right. Like, if we do it right now, we would kill millions. We don't know what we're doing.
But is this just a matter of allowing the technology to advance? And in terms of designer babies, we've I think made that a little more palpable, a little more amenable to common sense, to the extent that you say, well, parents can choose their children, but you wouldn't want that to be a state-sanctioned program for eugenics, but framed within the context of a consumerist society where people get to choose the eye color of their children, for example. It's spooky, certainly, but perhaps less frightening than the prospect of the government doing the same. Yeah? The question just becomes, well, what is the limit to that technological development in the absence of an idea of human perfectibility itself? I.e., what is it to be a good human being? What is a good life? What is a just community?
Well, that also is like what's dictating that as well. Like how is the other person even thinks to have that idea that what they want in a perfect child, for example, where is that coming from?
Mm-hmm. And we would say, well, that's just subjective. Yeah? That yeah, it may be based on cultural affinities or affiliations, in terms of our preferences, but we say that's just a kind of just a subjective choice. There's nothing inherently good about this child or that.
I think another important debate too is, luckily the debate ones, that's all like 50 years off, but I think the one that's more keen today is, has anyone heard like of stem cell therapy, more or less?
Mhm.
It's the process of, it's a way to also, they think might slow down aging, but it's a way to like cure body parts by injecting stem cells into you, so you live. And there's a debate, like, I think this is banned in America right now, is because the process, it's fundamentally like abortion-like, where it's like you take the copy of your own DNA, you make it into a fetus, and then add the 2 month one, you terminate it. So you have this big tumor of stem cells that we now inject it into you to live it. So there's a big debate going on. It's allowed in Canada but banned in America, where it's, there's a more question of should be. Use this kind of therapy to cure people. Is this, it's debated, it's only research that this can cure aging.
What's difficult for Grant about this whole question is that, this discussion in part kind of assumes that the technology is a set of tools, like techniques, that are external to us and that can be used for good purposes or bad. So it may be considered good if we could eliminate certain diseases, and would be considered bad if this were, the pathway to a racist eugenics, for example. That said, part of this discussion, now involves the question: should parents be able to choose whether they have a child with Down syndrome or not? Where is that boundary that discerns which lives are worth living and which ones are not?
I mean, it's scary. It's like, take away like the emotional side of people that's still alive. As a rational parent about to have a kid, would you choose to have a kid with Down syndrome or to avoid it?
That would be an incredibly difficult. That would be an incredibly difficult question. I wonder whether we have the capacity, both intellectually and emotionally, to make that kind of decision. In much the same way that I don't think we have the capacity to use nuclear weapons, I don't think we have the ethical capacity to reshape ourselves in our genetic code.
I think I might have to disagree. I think we do, even though I don't think the conclusion is what we would call mutually ethical. Because the always answer is no, you wouldn't. You would change that down maybe to be a normal kid, because that normal kid would have a more fulfilling good life on paper.
Yeah, I can imagine that argument being made. But again, for Grant here, where we go wrong is thinking that technology is a neutral set of tools. Technology shapes us in our very being. It conditions how we think about the good itself. It shapes our measuring stick by which we judge the effects of our actions. Technology is us. In as much as it is a worldview, it's a way of looking at the world. It's a set of practices and perceptions, not a neutral tool that we can use for this end or that. And the strongest indication of that we get from Nietzsche, for Grant, with the idea that the good is a human historical construct. The good consists of human values. That is, things that we will onto the world as justifications for this project of the mastery of human and non-human nature. The other definition, I mentioned there are two. That's the one that Grant keeps coming back to. Technology is the mastery of human and non-human nature. He traces this further back behind Nietzsche, right to Machiavelli. When Machiavelli sees nature as Fortuna, as like a raging river in flood that needs to be dammed and diked, and brought into submission. Grant says it's in the early moderns that we really begin to assess nature as something that we want to remove ourselves from, including our human nature. We want to get as far away from our state of nature as we can for say, Hobbes. The other definition, though, of technology for Grant is as the co-penetration of knowing and making. The co-penetration of knowing and making. You could think that technology is just applied science. That's another one of those kind of platitudinous definitions of technology. Technology is just applied science. And then, much like that definition of technology is a neutral set of tools, that implies that, we can put scientific advances to work here or there. We can build, use nuclear, or harnessing of atomic forces to create nuclear power plants or nuclear weapons. You decide. Grant comes back to Oppenheimer here. He says that, if the experiment is sweet, you have to go ahead with it. There's something for Grant there's an internal dynamic that drives technological development, even in the absence of a goal outside of it.
Is Graham predicting like the process of AIs inventing things themselves? Because nowadays, for example, like self-driving cars or like stock market bots, we don't code them. We have the robots code themselves. Is he predicting that?
I think the idea is, it's not about futurism and predicting the future, just trying to understand what if technology is us, well, what are we? What is this technology? And he says that we think about human purpose, human historical purpose, our ability to shape our own history, to act creatively in history, to produce novelties without recourse to any idea of the good. We have technology creating new aspirations, new values, and new problems then too. And those problems then invite better technology that would solve the problems created by technology. And so in that sense, technological development becomes increasingly autonomous, increasingly self-justifying, and not needing, therefore, any attribution of human purpose to it. Have I told you the story about my encounter with Roberta Bondar? No? I had a delightful opportunity. We're Dr. Roberta Bondar, Canada's first female astronaut in space, and got to spend a day with her in her lab. And she did much of her research on space sickness, how the people get sick when they go into space, and the muscle wasting, bone wasting, and this sort of thing. And I asked her, I said, Dr. Bondar, would you take that as an indication that human beings aren't meant to be in space? That we're, by our very nature, terrestrial beings? That our very bones and muscles, the fact that we can hold our stomach together is an indication that we're suited to this place in some essential way? And she said, that's absolutely ridiculous. Of course not. No, we can go to space. Look, I went. And there are certain problems that come up, and we need to find technological solutions to those problems. So, use of elastic bands to create some impact through exercise to build up the muscles and the bones. There's a way around. But the very idea that we had a nature, that we were suited to a certain purpose or place, for her within this, and this is very much a modern scientific technological outlook, was just beyond the pale. Like it's so backwards, that idea, and backwards in such a way that would hold us back from our full liberation. Yeah.
He's going to say much heated against your astronauts, but Tim and I also say, humans, we're not meant to live in Canada. Look, we have to wear our jackets, or else we're going to freeze to death. We shouldn't live here.
No, human beings need techne, though, and I would distinguish between techne and technology. All peoples have had techniques, clearly, or techne according to
where they're living, even in the Arctic.
everyone. Yeah, and amazing. You look at Inuit parkas or waterproof sealskin boots, like really nice stuff, suited to that place.
But you think you're going to astronauts making things to treat sickness is the exact same thing as the Inuits building these giant parkas from whale fats and furs. It's the exact same
I
process.
would
No.
say no, because the environment, you're in the environment. The environment produces what your body or your mind or your heart, or all the medicines that you would need to live on Earth. Whereas if you were in space, you're not going to be able to find anything you need up there
I mean,
to survive. If
we
you don't have it in your,
If we go
little
further,
thing.
like think of if we think of like things down to like its rawest elements, everything to make anything exists in space. All of our molecules came from supernova explosions. Anything that we can find here, we can find in space.
But let's just sort of fix on this idea of techne and technology, because I'm just trying to make the argument that they're inherently different. Again, all peoples have had techne. The idea of technology, I would argue, is historically unique. Yeah? And it's born out of this notion that, again, nature is stuff, which is a rather unique notion to the West, had profound liberating effects, but in such a way that we're basically denied any sense of an intrinsic or inherent good that exists in the world itself, short of what we will onto the world in these acts of mastery. I'll give you an example in terms of, has everyone used an axe here? Yeah, chopped with an axe. You know, you can chop a tree down with an axe, but you realize when you're chopping a tree down with an axe that you need to know what trees are and how they're put together. Yeah? You don't just go chop, chop, chop straight away at the trunk. You need to, you know, the growth rings can split from one another rather easily. So if you cut at an angle, you can create a little wedge opening there, a notch. And if you line up this notch with that notch, the tree falls where you want it to go, but you need to, again, be kind of attuned to where the branches are. Is it leaning? Is it windy? Is it solid right through to the heart? You know, all of these questions about the intrinsic structure of the tree. The axe just allows you to find your way to that structure. Has anyone seen a feller buncher? In terms of how forestry occurs today, at least in the pulpwood industry? So what happens is the machine comes up, grabs the tree, circular saw cuts it at the bottom. The tree is stripped up to the top, thrown onto the back of the machine. The machine knows how much cordage it has in the back and is connected in real time back to the pulp and paper mill. That is a technological approach to tree cutting, yeah, that requires no sensitivity to the tree itself. Yeah? That's a way of transforming that tree into cellulose.
Actually, couldn't you argue that this actually does provide information about the tree, because in order to make the machine, you had to know the composition of the tree, how to make the saw to cut it.
Sure,
You're applying all these things, except you're applying it in the making of the machine, but not in the process of cutting the tree.
Yeah, you know something about the tree, but in such a way that doesn't allow you to appreciate that tree as having any intrinsic value. Yeah,
Yeah, you're not designing a robot, so
yeah. There's no craft in that, in the way that there's craft involved in chopping down a tree with an axe. And again, axes are not unfamiliar to many of the peoples of the world. Everyone's had chopping instruments. Yeah, Odysseus in the Odyssey builds a raft, and a goddess comes to him and says, "Here's an adze. Here's how to use it. Here's how to make this raft." People make things. They've always made things. Human beings need art in order to shape our environments, in order to live and live a good life. Human beings need art. One basic sense of techne is just as craft or as art. We're artful creatures. That's clear. But the idea that there could be a technological system that would marshal all of the resources of the planet, yeah, and put them to human purposes, that's the distinctly technological outlook. Yeah? And it is unique to our particular moment in time. Yeah? It's what's most our own. It shapes our understanding of who we are and of what is worth knowing and doing. Let's take a little look at the text here. Maybe we'll finish with this, page 27, because I do want to leave time. Okay, page 27, this first full paragraph. In the conceptions of history now prevalent amongst those creative men who plan the mastery of the planet, changing the world becomes ever more an end in itself. So the point is not to change it to a good end. The point is to just change it, to master it. It is undertaken less simply to overcome the natural accidents that frustrate our humanity. It's cold outside. You need to cut down these trees to make a cabin. We've got to get by in the world using, again, craft. And more for the sheer sake of the creation of novelty. That becomes the outcome. That becomes the good or the goal, the creation of novelty itself. This movement inevitably grows amongst the resolute. So if you don't know what the end is, what the good is, the measure in terms of our willing, in terms of our action, becomes our resolve. This is recurrent through existentialist thinkers from Nietzsche to Heidegger to Sartre and on. That, you need to act with resolve. You need to hear the call to conscience, even if there isn't an idea of the good that would guide you. You need to act as if there was. You need to will that idea of the good for yourself. That's what resolve is. Willing something, even if you don't know really what to will, but just to fix upon one thing, say, we are going to do this, just because. This movement inevitably grows among the resolute as the remnants of any belief in a lovable actuality disappear. As if there's something actual that's inherently lovable. There's something lovable about a tree. I imagine we've all been sort of in awe or wonder before an especially large or beautiful tree.
I thought you were going to ask if we all seen a tree before.
No, I'm asking if we've all sort of had an experience of awe in relation to a tree before.
Usually like how tall it is usually.
Yeah, it's standard that
They're
way.
beautiful. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's feel like they've been there for longer than I've been alive, and like
Sure.
Just
It's awesome.
huge beyond landscape.
Mhm.
Looking up, it's like this 5-story high tree.
It transcends you. The world makes you sometimes feel small in relation to this much larger ordered whole. And Tanya, you mentioned it's beautiful. Beauty for Plato and for Grant is an indication of that affinity too. In the same way that apples dropping from trees indicates the spontaneous beneficence of nature, the fact that nature is just so darn beautiful indicates that very basic affinity that we have for it. Even from the perspective of the moon, the Earth looks beautiful seen in retrospect. You've all seen that picture of Earthrise from one of the Apollo missions there. The sort of horizon of the moon and the blue Earth planet rising up over it. For me, it's hard to see that and not feel kind of homesick in a way. Like we don't belong on the moon. This looks particularly barren and like a place I'd like to get away from, and that looks accommodating. That looks like where we should be back there. Yeah.
The weird thing is, I also think very human creations, I think also I get the same feeling from when I first went into the Parliament, or when you stand in front of the Empire State Building, or even when I stare at the moon. When I stare at the moon, I don't think about the beauty of the moon. I'm like, we've been there.
Okay, that's impressive.
Amazing.
Well,
Yeah.
I would say you could even say like if you were to go to a different country, let's say it doesn't have like I've been to Peru where they really have to monitor how much water you use, and the quality of the water and even like the landscapes and everything so different. It made me so homesick. Like even the sound, the jungle and everything. It's like you don't hear that back home, and there's something really really lonely about being way far away.
Yeah,
Do you have
yeah.
to monitor your water even in like the capital city of Peru? Or are you like in the outskirts?
I went into the town.
But you mentioned that feeling of belonging to a particular place. Grant uses this language of autochthony. Autochthony, like of being of that place, and of experiencing some, he calls it our primal. And for Grant, in terms of the Canadian experience at least, the primal of two of the three founding nations is the settlers' encounter with the new land. That's our kind of original moment in terms of the nation. And yet, what's unique about the North American experience, politically in his view, is that North America, at least in terms of the dominant culture, has no history prior to the Age of Progress. We can trace things back to Athens and Jerusalem, to Christianity and to Platonism, but there's some sense in which there's something inherently novel about this political project.
Aren't you ignoring the effects that the indigenous Highland settler society itself? Our society was fundamentally shaped by the interactions we had with
This is true.
peoples, our way of life.
This is true.
Even if the dominant culture is still white settler,
Yeah.
you can argue that in some sense we were shaped by the indigenous cultures that existed for thousands of years.
I don't know the apocryphal myth or story that says that when the founding fathers in the United States were writing the Constitution, that they had two members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at hand to ask questions do when they didn't have an answer for it.
Back to the text here. We will, not so much for some end beyond will, but for the sake of willing itself. In this sense, the challenge of the will is endless to the resolute, because there is always more creation to be carried out. Our freedom can even start to make over our own species. As Hegel so clearly expounded, doing is in some sense always negation. Recall how Hegel understands action in terms of a negation of the given. It is the determination that what is present shall not be, some other state shall. This is what it means to will. But it is positive in the sense that in its negating of what is, it strives to bring forth its own novel creations, even if just for the sake of their being novel. In this sense, the burden of creation itself is placed upon us. Resoluteness for that task becomes the key virtue for the history makers, a resoluteness that finds the sources of novelty in their own values, in quotation marks. Again, human-made goods. They assert that meaning is not to be found in what is actually present for us, but in that which we can yet bring to be. This becomes the standard. This becomes increasingly progress for the sake of progress. And the question, I'm anticipating now the second set of readings from Grant here after the break, the question becomes, well, how is that lovable? How can you love that fate in the absence of some idea of the good that would inform it? That's the question that has Grant kind of step back from this modern, liberal, progressive project, again, invoking this idea of a good that transcends space and time. All right, let's take a little break so we have time for Andrew's presentation after the break there. All right. Hey.
For more on this topic, actually, does Professor Tomatin's book, The Great Reversal, it's kind of like on